Hi, in this video we're going to look at creating a tabbed or multi-page interface in HISE. Now the basic principle of a tabbed interface is that you have sets of controls, some are visible and some are hidden, so you'll hide some controls when you show other controls. And in HISE this is really easy to do because we can actually group controls into panels. And then all we have to do is hide certain panels and show the panels we want to show. So let's start by adding a main interface script. And if your setup looks a little different to mine, try playing around with these buttons over here at the left hand side to show the various panels of the HISE interface. So we're going to add two panels and we're going to put some controls in each of them, just so I can demonstrate this principle. So there's one panel, I'll make it a little larger. And I'm going to press Ctrl D to duplicate it. And there's a second panel, and HISE automatically names them panel 1 and panel 2. Okay, so while I've got the second panel clicked, I'm going to right click on it, and I'm going to go add new slider. And you can see over here in the component list, the slider, which is called knob 1, is within panel 1. So we have this tree view and the knob has been placed as a child of the panel, and actually I can click this to fold that up. So we'll also add a button in here, and let's add another button. So these are all the controls that are in panel 1, and now I'm going to add some controls to panel 2 as well. Doesn't matter what they are, this is just for demonstration. Okay. So now we've got two panels, panel 1 and panel 2, and they each have some controls inside them. So we can think of each panel as being a page on your interface or a tab if you're doing a tabbed interface. Tabs and pages are essentially the same thing, it's just different ways of thinking about the same concept and different ways of using them within your interface design. So we can toggle a panel's visibility using this visible property over in the property editor. And when we hide or show a panel, we also hide or show all of the children that are in that panel, all of the controls that are within the panel. So this property, this visible property, we can also control it through scripting. For example, we can choose which panel to show when a particular button is pressed. So that's pretty much how you create a tabbed interface. There's not much more to it than that really. That's the basic principle. You toggle that visible property for various panels. So the rest of this video, we're just going to be looking at various examples of how we can do that in practice. And I'm going to try and cover the sort of common use cases, so the ones that you'll use most often, but there are various ways to apply this. So I'm actually going to start by just deleting everything we've got here. I just wanted to have that there just to show you the basic principle. And I'm going to add 3 new panels to the interface. So there's the first one, there's the second one, and there's the third one. And we're going to have these stacked on top of each other in a little while. I'm not going to put any controls inside them, but I'm going to change the colour of them so that we can see which panel is visible. So I'll just change these properties here. This one can be a blue one. And this one can be a green one. So of course in practice you wouldn't just have these coloured, you'd have your controls inside them. But for our purposes it's easier if we just have them coloured. Okay, the next thing I'm going to do is actually stack them on top of each other, and the way I'm going to do that is I'm going to select them all and I'm just going to set the X and Y position of each of them to the same value for all of them. So it'll be let's do 10 by 10 and 10. So they're actually all in the same location now. but we can only see panel 3. But if I hide panel 3, we'll see panel 2, and if I hide panel 2, we'll see panel 1. And I'll just make all of these a little larger as well. So these are going to be our 3 pages, or our 3 tabs. And we're going to have 3 buttons as well, one for each page or tab. Now this is put it, because I had the panel selected, it's actually put it as a child of the panel. I don't want that, so let me just make sure I'm not selected on anything there. Okay, there we go. And we'll have 3 of these. Now in this example, we're going to have 1 panel for each button, or 1 button for each panel. So that means 1 button is always going to be active. So what we can do is put these buttons inside a radio group. So I've just selected all of the buttons. I'm going to come over here to the property editor, go down to radio group, and I'm going to set the radio group to 1. I'm going to hit enter, and I'll just hit compile over here just to make sure that's worked and we can test them. So you can see it automatically toggles between the buttons. So when I click the next button, the one that was turned on turns off. So only 1 can be active at a time, and 1 will always be active. I can't turn button 1 off. Right, so now it's time to start scripting. We're going to grab a reference to each panel and each button and store them in 2 separate arrays. So we'll have one array with all the panels in and 1 array with references to all the buttons. So the usual way you grab a reference is you right click on the control in the component list and you select create script variable definition, and then you paste that into your script and you'll get something like that. But since we're going to want all of the panels in 1 array, I'm going to use a loop instead. So we're going to have an array and we can call it panels, or you might want to call it tabs or pages, whatever's most suitable for the interface that you're creating. But to keep it simple, I'm going to call it panels. And we're going to have another one called buttons. And now we're going to have a loop. And we could put the number of panels and the number of buttons into a constant. Yeah, in fact, let's do that. So we know how many we've got. So we're going to have const var num. We'll call it num tabs. And we've got 3 of them. So put 3. And then our loop, we can go I is less than num tabs, I plus plus. I'm going through some of these basic things quite quickly, like defining loops. So if you are unfamiliar with this, I have done another video. It's called something like HISE Scripting 101, where I cover this sort of stuff in more detail. So now we're going to go panels I, so the first index, content.getComponent. And the component name is what we're going to put in here, and we've got panel 1 is the first component, so we'll put panel, no we won't, we'll put it in quotes, panel plus, and then brackets, I plus 1. And then we have to add the plus 1 because our loop is starting from 0, but the name of our panels starts from 1, so we've got panel 1, 2, 3. And then we're going to do exactly the same thing but for the buttons. Just hit F5, make sure that's working. Yep, that's all good. So we're also going to define a control callback, and that's going to be assigned to all of the buttons. So no matter which button is clicked, the same callback function will be triggered. So let's do that now. Create a function. We'll call it change page. We'll call it num tabs, haven't we? So we'll have change tab. Component and value, because it's going to be a callback function. And we'll assign that to each of the buttons here. Set control callback. And then we just give it the name of the function. So let's just test that this function is being called when the buttons are clicked. So we can just do console.print and I'll say hello world. And now I'm going to click the buttons and we can see it's printing it out. But here's something interesting. If I click the button, it's actually printing it twice. And the reason for that is when button, well, let's start with button 1. So button 1's enabled. I'm going to click button 3, and what's going to happen is button 1 will be disabled, and that will trigger the callback. And then button 3 will be enabled, and that will trigger the callback again. So we actually only want this callback stuff to happen when for the button that becomes enabled. So when button 3 was enabled, we want the callback to happen just for button 3. We don't care about the button that's being turned off. And the way we do that is we can just put a check in here to make sure that the value of the button is 1. We say if value, let's put that in brackets, value, we can put equals 1, or we can just put if value because it defaults to 1. So hit compile, and now when I change button, we should only see that message appear once. So that's good. So the rest of our callback code will go inside this if statement. So the first thing we want to do is we want to find out which button was pressed, because this function is called when all of the buttons are pressed. It doesn't matter which one it is, this function is going to be called. But we need to know which button so that we know which panel to turn on. So the only information we get is the component, which is a reference to the button, and the button's value. But what we can do is we can take the component and we can see where this component is in the buttons array and get its index in the array. So if the third button's pressed, we know that that's going to be the second index in the array. So let's do that. So we're going to have a local variable. I'm going to call it IDX, short for index. We're going to type buttons. Going to type dot, and then we're going to use, in fact we can see it over here in the API collection. So under array we've got this function index of, and if we right click on that, it tells us what it does. It searches the array and returns the first index. So you give it the name of the array, which is what we've got, buttons, put a dot and then put index of. And what are we searching for? We're searching for the component that triggered this callback. And if it finds it in the array, it will return the index. That means it'll give us the index and put it in this variable. If it doesn't find it, it will return -1. But we know it's always going to find the button, because the only way this function will ever be called is if a button is pressed. So we don't have to worry about checking if it's -1. So let's just test this. Let's just print out the index of the button. So when we click the first button, it should say 0. Second button, it should say 1. Third button, it should say 2. So now we can check which button was pressed and display the appropriate panel. So how do we do this? The best way I've found is we can just hide all of the panels and show the one for the given index. It's the simplest way I found, so we just have a loop. I is less than, we can use num tabs again, or we can actually use, let's do this a bit differently. Let's have button panels dot length, which is going to be the same as num tabs because we've got 3 tabs and we've got 3 buttons, but it's just a different way of doing it. And we're going to hide each panel. So again, we're just iterating through this same panels array, and we're going to set a property, and the property we're going to set is the visible property up here. And you can set pretty much all of these properties in the same way. Some of them have can't be set, or some need to be set using other functions, but most of them can be set using this set function. But we're going to set the visible property, so I put the name of the property, and then we can put true if we want to show it, or we can put false if we want to hide it. So we're going to set them to false, so it's going to hide all of them. And then we're going to do panels, but this time we're going to put IDX in there. That's the index of the button. and it's one button per panel, so the index of the button and the index of the panel is the same. And we'll set visible true. So we're showing the panel that corresponds to the button that was pressed. And I'll hit F5, clear that console again, and let's test it. So that's your basic tabbed interface. Really simple, hardly any lines of code. Let's put a few comments in here. Grab control references. You can comment this in more detail if you need it. Tab button callback function. Get index of clicked button. Hide all panels. Show selected panel. So hopefully that was nice and straightforward for you. This, I believe, is probably going to be the tabbed interface or multi-page setup that most people are going to want. This is the one I find myself using most often when I want a sort of multi-tabbed interface, or I want part of my interface to be multi-tabbed. But now we're going to look at improving this code. So there are a few things we can do. First of all, this set visible false. If you remember, I said we can set a lot of these properties using the set command, but it's also possible to set some of them, or sometimes it's only possible to set some of them using other functions. Well, that's actually true of this visible property. So another way we can write this, instead of set visible, we can use the function show control, and all we've got to do is put true or false in there. So that does exactly the same thing as this set visible. It's just a different way of writing it, and I think it's a bit shorter and it's clearer. The first time you see it, you go, okay, I know what that's doing straight away. So change that one to true, and there's a typo. Oh, need to put a semicolon there. And again, that works just the same. Now, if you know me and my coding style, I like to reduce the number of lines of code as much as possible without destroying the readability. So we're going to add a little extra bit in here, which I particularly like this method. So we've got this panels.showControl, and then we're essentially doing the same thing here, but for a particular index. And that doesn't really sit too well with me doing the same thing twice. So let's change that. We can actually do it all on one line. So what we're doing with this, where we're saying show control false and show control true, we're going through each index in the panels array and hiding the control, and then we're going to a specific index in the panels array and showing a control. But we've already actually looked at that index because we're going through all the indexes here. So why not put a little if statement in the for loop? Okay, well let's have a look how that would work. So we do if I equals index, then show the control. So change that to true and have an else, and then we hide the other ones that aren't the index. So let's see how that works. So I'll hit compile, and that works exactly the same. But now I'm thinking, now we've got extra lines of code, and again we're still doing the same thing twice. So what we can actually do, this is a little nugget of logic, this I equals index, and that on its own, if we take away the if, just take that away, if we were to print this out, and I'll just comment out these other lines for now, if we were to just print out this little nugget, let's see what we get. So you can see we get 0, 0, 1. And that actually corresponds to this button state, because button 0 is 0, button 1 is 0, and button 2 is 1. So it's actually 0, 0, 1. And if I click button 2, we're going to get 0, 1, 0. Okay? So this by itself, without the if statement, has a value. And it actually tells us, because we're going through it in a loop, it actually tells us which button is enabled, because it will return 1. So this is a really complicated way of saying that we don't need this if statement. We can just take this little nugget Let's just take this as well. Just make sure that's tabbed correctly. Let's get rid of that. And we can put our little nugget in there. So now this will return 0 if the index doesn't match doesn't match the current panel that we're iterating through. And it will return 1 if the index does match the panel currently selected by I. So we get exactly the same functionality, it's just another way of writing it, and I love using these little bits of sort of inline logic when it's appropriate, and I just think it's a neater way to write it. When I first came across this sort of thing in other people's code, I didn't really understand what it meant, because I thought this kind of thing only worked in an if statement, but when I realised that it was a standalone piece of logic that returned a value just sort of in place where it is, I realised the power of it. So I use this kind of thing all the time. I recommend you do if you find it useful as well. Okay, so that's the basic version, and then we've improved the code of the basic version. Now let's have a look at something slightly different. Let's say we didn't want to have one button enabled all the time. We wanted it so you could have no buttons enabled, and I actually have a project where I've needed this. And in the state where no buttons are enabled, you want to show a different panel. So let's add a fourth panel. And we'll change the colour, do it a sort of yellowy colour, that's fine. And I'm actually going to give this a name, I'll call it a different panel. Just so it's not in the same logic as panel 1, 2 and 3. Because we're imagining you're wanting to do something different with this that's kind of separate from the main panels. So we'll get a script reference to this one, and this is just going to be a reference just to this panel. We'll put it there. Actually, I'll put it above these because those are kind of related. So we've got a different panel. And we want to make sure that you can disable the buttons if you need to, so that means we have to take them out of the radio group, and we're going to handle the sort of toggling in the code. So before we look at hiding and showing this particular panel, in fact let's just hide it for now, so we're not dealing with it. We're just going to look at enabling this toggling, because if you look, they don't toggle anymore because we've taken them out of the radio group. So we need to re-add that toggling. And the way we do that is very similar actually to hiding and showing the panels, and we can even do it in this loop. So instead of calling it hide all panels, call it, shouldn't be that anyway, so let's just say toggle buttons panels. So what we're going to do is pretty much just copy this and change buttons, change panels for buttons, and we don't want to show the control though, we want to set the value. We want all the buttons to be visible. Let me just remake those visible. There we go. And I think that should work. So yeah, so we've got the toggling function back of the buttons there, and we can turn them all off if we want. So again, this little inline logic, really helpful. Really makes it easy to write code quickly and neatly and efficiently. We're also making use of this existing loop, so we're not having to write even more extra code, and we're making use again of this local variable, so it makes this more valid to have it in a local variable and not just reference this function directly. So I really like doing it this way. Okay. So now we've got to make it so when no buttons are enabled, all the panels are hidden, and this one, a different panel, is shown. So first of all, let's make it so when all of the buttons are disabled, all of the panels are hidden. Now I can think of a few ways to do this. So I'm going to go with a way that I think is probably the most straightforward. First of all, I'm going to delete this if value thing, because this was always checking if the button was enabled, but now we're going to have a situation where the button might not be enabled. So we're going to get rid of that, and we'll just take that, tab that back one. But now if I compile it, we're not going to be able to disable a button. So I can't disable button 3 because we've got this where it's always setting it. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to add a little more inline logic to this function here where we're setting the value. So this bit of inline logic is saying, is the button that we're currently iterating on, so we're going through the buttons in the array, saying, is it equal to the button that was clicked? And if it is, it's automatically going to result in a 1. And because we've got it in the set value function, that means it's going to turn the button on. So no matter which button's clicked, the button is always going to be turned on, right? So that's the first thing to think about. Now, if the button's already on and I click it, then the value that's passed in here is going to be 0 because the button's already on, I click it, that means I turn it off. The value that's passed in is 0, but because it's then set to 1 here, we can see it sort of blinks. Let's zoom that in a bit. We'll see it blinks off and on briefly. Okay, so what we actually need to do is we only want to set the value to 1 here if the value that's passed in is also 1. So the logic we're going to use for that, we could put an if statement to say if value is 1 and just have it here, if value, let's see, if value is 1, then do this. So now I can turn it off or on, and we can go through all the others. Okay, so like we had before. But again, I'm going to use inline logic, so we can just take this little nugget here, and we can put it inside here as well, and we just put a couple of and symbols. So now we're saying if the button was clicked, and when it was clicked, it was already off, so we've turned it on, so the value equals 1, then this overall unit of logic is going to return 1. If this isn't true, so if the button value isn't 1, or it's not the button that was clicked, so it's one of the other buttons, then overall this will return 0 and the button won't turn on. And just to make this a little neater, I can even get rid of this equals 1. And this should work just the same as we had a moment ago with the if statement. There we go. So we've extended this inline logic, which I really like. And the great thing is we can also put this in for the panels as well, so it will hide the panels if the button's disabled. So we get exactly the same functionality, but now when we disable all the buttons, all of the panels are also disabled. Okay, the last thing to do is check if all of the buttons are disabled, we show a different panel. And we're going to use more inline logic here. So I'll just put a comment, show a different panel when all buttons are off. Now it sounds like we've got to check if all the buttons are off, but actually we've only got to check if the button that was clicked is off, because this already takes care of turning off the other buttons whenever a button's clicked. So we've actually only got to check one button. So we're going to do more inline logic. So we've got this a different panel, and we're referring to this variable up here, of course, that we got earlier. We do .show control, and we're going to say not value. Is that right? Yeah, I think that's right. So we're saying, that's basically saying not 1. So there we go. Yeah. So if the button that we clicked is off, that means it won't, its value will be 0, so we put not value, which is the equivalent of writing value equals 0. So it's the same as writing that. But I just think it's a bit neater to write not value. But write whatever makes more sense to you, because I know sometimes this shorthand stuff, it can make it more difficult to read if you're not used to it. Okay, so that's working as we expect. We can also look over here to see which panels are being enabled and disabled. Sometimes this is useful if you don't have bright coloured panels like we do, to see exactly which controls are being enabled. You can look in the widget list and see which ones are visible. So you can see when I click them, the highlighted one changes. So the ones that are grayed out are the ones that are invisible. Okay, so let's just quickly recap. just to make sure, I'm hoping that this has come across in a way that is comprehensible. So we haven't changed anything with the buttons and the panels in this section. We're still just calling the same function whenever a button is clicked, getting the index of the clicked button, going through all of the panels and all of the buttons in through our two arrays, and we're just checking to see if the index of the clicked button matches the index of the panel or the button that we're looking at. And we're also checking if the value of the button is 1. If both those things match, we show the control, show the panel, and enable the button. If any of those things don't match, we hide the panel and we turn off the button. And then lastly, we come here and we say if the button is turned off, show the fourth panel a different panel. So far we've been using buttons to select panels, but all the buttons providing is an array index, okay? So we're just checking which button, and that's giving us an index. And then we're using that index to display the panel. But there's no reason we couldn't use another control, and instead of getting an index, we could just get a value. For example, we could use a knob or a drop-down menu. So let's delete our buttons and see how this would look with using a knob. So I'm going to save this first of all, just so I can send this to my Patreon supporters. So we'll have, we'll call this one with buttons.xml. Okay, so let's delete these buttons. I'm going to delete this fourth panel as well. We're not going to work with that at the moment. So we'll just clear up the code here as well. So we've still got our 3 panels. They're invisible at the moment. Let's make those visible. And we don't have any buttons, so we'll get rid of that code. And we'll leave this stuff for now, but we're going to change it. But let's just add a knob to the interface. And we're going to change the min and max. So we're going to allow it to go up to 2, because we've got 3 panels, 0, 1 and 2. The step size is going to be 1, so it's only going to go up in whole numbers. The middle position, that can be 1. Default value is 0, so that's fine, and we'll just click compile on that. We might get an error. No, we didn't get an error. That's okay then. So we can make it so when we move the knob value, we change the panel, which might be useful if you want to display different images or different controls depending on the value of a knob. This could also be a drop-down menu. We might look at that in a moment as well. So let's get a reference to the knob first of all. Again, I'm just leaving it with the default name, but you should give this something more logical. So we'll create a reference. And we also need to add a callback function to this knob, and we can use the same one we've got, change tab. Set control callback change tab, and let's just we're not going to be checking for the index in the buttons array because we don't have a buttons array, and this isn't a button, so I can delete that. That'll just be toggling the panels now because we're not going to have any buttons. And for now, I just want to test this, so I'm just going to comment this out, and we're not doing that, so I can delete that as well. Okay, so let's just see what value we get. So this is just to make sure that the knob is correctly linked to this change tab function. So as I move this knob, we should see its value printed in the console. Okay, so that works. So there isn't going to be much different here, just we're not going to need this value thing in this logic. Oh, and I can get rid of that now. So instead of checking if I equals IDX, we're going to check if I equals value. So we're iterating through all of the panels. If the panel we're iterating on happens to match the knob's current value, then we show that panel. 1, 2. Okay, so that's quite simple, especially after we've seen the more complicated version with the buttons. And we could do the same with a combo box. So we'll have panel 1, 2, 3. You can call these whatever you want. and I'll hit compile on that. I'm going to delete the knob now. We're going to do it with a combo box. So we're going to get the reference to the combo box, assign the callback function exactly the same way, change tab. Now there's going to be something a little different here. If we just have a look at the value of the combo box. So if I select the first one, panel 1, you can see it actually gives us a value of 1, not 0. So combo boxes start from 1, they don't start from 0 like knobs do or like buttons do. So all that means is that in our script, we've just got to account for that extra 1. And where we've got value here, we've just got to do value minus 1. And now we get the same result. And you can modify this again if you want it so when a different option is selected, or you could even have like a no option, it would show a different panel. And the same with the knob, you could have it so when the knob's at 0, it shows a different panel or something like that. So there's all these variations. You can also do a mixture, so you could have part of your interface is tabbed by buttons, another part's tabbed by a knob, another part's tabbed by a combo box. You don't have to have just one tabbed section to your interface. You can do all kinds of different things. So that's a few different variations on a simple idea, which is just hiding and showing sets of controls. The fact that we have panels in HISE so we can group controls just makes it really, really easy to do. If you've ever done this in Contact, you know you have to put all the individual controls into arrays and hide them and show them and keep track of them and stuff, and it's not very pleasant. In HISE, it's really easy. Stick them in a panel. The panel is your page or your tab, and you just hide the page you want to hide and show the page you want to show. So there are many ways to execute this principle, but hopefully I've covered enough bases in this video to get you started, and I hope I've covered the most common use cases as well. Certainly this is the most common use cases I've come across. One other thing I'd like to show you, in fact I will just save this as another XML. We'll call this one combo box. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions, suggestions or comments, please leave them below the video on YouTube or next to the video on Patreon if you're watching it there. Thanks also to my Patreon supporters for helping me create this tutorial. If you'd like to join my Patreon community for as little as $1, the link is in the video description on YouTube. So this month my $5 and $10 patrons will get some code snippets from this video, and I'm also going to be doing a bonus video with some more tabbed interface stuff. That's all for this video. Hope you found it helpful. Happy scripting, and I'll see you next time.